and we'll get started. On behalf of the UC Master Gardeners of Santa Clara County, I'd like to welcome you to Growing Tomatoes Successfully. My name is Sharon Erickson. I'm a Master Gardener volunteer here in Santa Clara County and will be your moderator for tonight's session. The University of California Master Gardener program extends research-based information about home horticulture and pest management to the public. Tonight's program is being co-sponsored by the Palo Alto Library. We're grateful for their support. And now I'd like to introduce your presenter for this session, Joan Cloutier. Joan has been a UC Master Gardener volunteer since 2009. And with that, Joan, why don't you take it away?
Okay, tonight, thank you for coming here tonight. And we're going to talk about tomatoes, growing tomatoes in your garden. So we're going to discuss things like planting practices, soil fertilizer, staking, pruning, watering, and some other cultural requirements, as well as diseases and insect pests and a few varieties, a little bit about varieties too. So let's see here. Okay, so one of the things I want to mention is that, let me do something to the screen here. Okay, tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants all are very closely related, and they do have similar requirements. So a lot of things we talk about here tonight will also apply to peppers and eggplants. So they're all in the Solanaceae or the nightshade family. Okay, why are tomatoes so popular? They are definitely the most popular warm season crop that people like to grow. First, tomatoes can produce fruit for about 4 months, sometimes longer. So it's a long-term crop. You can get a lot of tomatoes. A good plant could yield, 20, 28 pounds of fruit. In some cases, maybe even higher. So if you're getting like 12 or 14 pounds of fruit, there's probably something wrong, or maybe, cultural practices or the variety you picked or something like that. Because most tomatoes, you should get about 20 or 28 pounds of fruit on a plant. And the other reason why they're so popular, there's so many dishes and cuisines and different types of foods that use tomatoes. All right, seeds. We'll talk about seeds versus transplants. Okay, you still could plant tomato seeds if you wanted to. Don't have too much of a window left, but if you plant them within the next week, you will still have enough time, because you should start seeds maybe about 6 to 8 weeks before you plant them outside in your garden. So anyway, if you start them, pretty soon, you should be okay. With a heating pad, the seeds will germinate much quicker. Usually tomato seeds might take 6 to 12 days, but if you have them on a heating pad or temperatures 70 to 86 degrees, they could germinate in like 4 to 8 days. You have a lot of choices if you plant seeds. There's lots of new varieties, disease-resistant varieties, just lots of choices. Lots of different types of tomatoes that you can get from seed. But if you don't have the conditions to grow your own seeds, or you don't have the time, and some of you probably don't, you could get transplants from the garden center. And there are still some pretty good tomato varieties that I'll point out later that are pretty reliable and that are somewhat disease resistant that you could get and have good flavor. But if you buy transplants or plants from the garden center, you want to look for quality plants. Those sitting around for a few weeks might not be so good, especially if they've been outside in the cold nighttime temperatures, because in most of our areas, we're still getting temperatures in the 40s or mid 40s at night. And that's kind of cold for tomatoes. They can get a lot of diseases, especially in the low or mid 40s, 40 degrees temperatures. And also, if we get a cold rainstorm, tomatoes do not like cold rainstorms. They can get all kinds of, or they're more likely to get diseases if they go through a cold rainstorm. So just think of that. I don't know, it might rain Friday, I guess, tomorrow, or no, Saturday. So just think about this. Okay, if you've already purchased tomatoes, and it's really early to plant tomatoes in your garden right now, but if you've already purchased them and didn't plant them yet, What you might want to do is take them in at night, because again, the 45-degree temperatures at night are not good for tomatoes, and the roots will not grow very well if it's in the 40s at nighttime. But then you could take them to a warm outside in a warm, sunny location during the day. And you should have a pretty good tomato plant if you do this. You know, take them in at night and put them out during the day. And that should solve the problem if you've already bought them. Okay, when to plant, like I just mentioned, soil must be warm. Some experts think that the temperature of the soil should be at least 55 or higher. You know, it kind of depends. You have a little leeway on that, but if you're still getting night temperatures, like I said before, in the 40s or mid 40s, you're at high risk of getting diseases. So when to plant, a safe bet for planting tomatoes in the Bay Area would be like the end of April or beginning of May. And definitely at least the second half of April if you're going to plant them. The roots just don't grow in cold soil. And then you have all kinds of possible problems, not just root diseases, but foliar diseases too. So you just, you know, they might be okay, but you're taking a real high risk if you plant them this time of the year. And I just hate it when I see all these tomatoes in the garden center already. It's way too early. And watch the weather before planting also. If there is a big cold rainstorm coming, you better hold off until after that rainstorm. So again, planting early will not give you a head start. You will not get earlier tomatoes just because you planted them early, because the roots just don't grow much if it's cool. All right. Okay. Some other things about planting tomatoes. It's a good idea to plant them in a sunny area. Boy, 8 hours or more of sun would be ideal. Tomatoes can survive if you have maybe 6 hours of sun or more, but boy, when you get below 6 hours of sun a day, you know, you just won't get the yield. You may have, you know, you just won't have a real super healthy plant. But if you're just determined you want to plant tomatoes and you only have maybe 5 or 4.5 hours of sun, but you really want to plant tomatoes, try cherry tomatoes, because some of the cherry tomatoes, and I've seen other master gardeners who claim, oh, look at these cherry tomatoes, and they look really good. I only get, like this one guy, he was planting them in pots near some redwood trees where he doesn't get much sun. And I couldn't believe it. He said he was only getting 4 and 4.5 hours of sunlight, but he had cherry tomatoes and he was still getting pretty good, you know, pretty good plants and pretty good yield for cherry tomatoes under those conditions. So if you're on a patio or something and you're not getting 6 or 8 hours of sun, but you're getting maybe close to that, try cherry tomatoes. They're the easiest usually. It's really advantageous to add compost to your soil area. Compost has so many benefits. It's really the best amendment to add because there are beneficial microbes in compost that will help your plants absorb water and nutrients. So it's really good. Composted manure is a good addition at this time when you're planting. You can plant that, but watch the rates on the package, on the bag that you buy it in, and it'll say how much per 1,000 square feet. Don't go too high because manure, well, it can have some salts, and if you go too high, there is some danger you could burn the roots, especially if it's chicken manure. So just stay within the rates on the package. Okay, if you're not using that, nitrogen fertilizer, you can use a low rate at this time. A point I want to make is that tomatoes use more nitrogen than any other element. So, and if you're planting in your garden soil outside, usually we say nitrogen may be the only element you really need. So a nitrogen, something with nitrogen in, but only use a low rate when you're planting, because when you're planting, you just don't need much. And if you're using manure, then skip the other nitrogen fertilizer application. Okay. Oh, and fresh manure, I want to make a comment there. It could burn, and there's some food safety concerns with fresh manure on food crops. So you may want to make sure you buy composted manure. And anything in the bags in the garden center should be composted at really, usually they use, it's really hot temperatures they compost. So you should be okay. Okay, when you plant your tomatoes, Okay, you want to plant deep. Okay, and the reason for that is because tomatoes will actually put on more roots on the stem. So if you see this tomato plant on the left side, the original root ball, they dug it up. And the planting depth was here. They got some more roots right here after they planted it, a secondary root ball. So this is what happens if you plant them deep. And this is good. You want lots of roots. So that's good. So here you can see the person is planting there. Okay, if you're planting tomatoes peppers or eggplants, this does not apply to peppers and eggplants. They don't form the adventitious roots like tomatoes do. So you plant them even with the soil. Okay, here's another example. You can plant them sideways. That's fine because look at, you'll get another root ball somewhere in there. So that's good. All right, spacing. Spacing is important because you want to allow lots of space between the plants because crowded plants have more potential to harbor diseases and insect pests. Okay, make sure you read the plant tag or the seed package, or if they didn't give you information, try to look it up on Google or something, your variety, because there's so many different varieties that have different spacing requirements. There's tomatoes that get 8 feet tall and 4 feet wide, 3 feet or 4 feet wide, and some only get like 2.5 feet tall and 1.5 feet wide. So they do have different spacing requirements. Okay, yeah, like too much crowding. You just encourage more aphids and more other pests, diseases, because you're not getting enough air circulation and light. You want lots of air circulation and light to go into the plant. All right, there is something called high density planting of tomatoes. This is a way to try out more varieties if you want. You won't necessarily get a higher yield when you do that. You want to treat it like one plant, but you could put 2 different plants in one hole and treat it like one plant. So row and spacing guidelines should be followed, and it would be good to use similar growth habit tomatoes, like either 2 determinate tomatoes or 2 indeterminate tomatoes. And we'll get to that in a few minutes, okay? But get similar sized plants. And pruning will probably be necessary. You're going to have to do a little pruning, which is okay. You can prune tomatoes. It doesn't hurt them at all. So I do this with, sometimes I try 2 different cherry tomatoes in one large pot, and then I can try out new varieties because there's so many tomatoes, new varieties I want to try out every year, and I don't have space for everything. And this does work very well for cherry tomatoes, by the way. So it's just another thing you can try if you want. All right, mulch between plants. Mulch really helps retain moisture. It helps with weed control. There's a lot of materials you can use for mulch, and organic mulch is good because eventually it will turn into compost. And compost, of course, is really good for your plant roots. Now you can use plastic, like there you'll see a plastic mulch down there. Okay, you can use plastic, but the only thing where there's sure a lot of waste disposal problems with plastic. So I kind of hesitate about plastic right now. If you can reuse some black plastic you had or something, that might be okay. And the other thing, plastic that's used in agriculture with soil particles on it is not recycled. It's thrown in the garbage, in the dump. It goes right to the dump site. At this point in time, maybe it'll change next year or 3 years from now. But I've been reading a lot about this, and there is no agricultural plastic that's used for mulch that's recycled at this point in time. So it's something to think about. But black plastic mulch will warm the soil quite a bit. So again, if you have some and you can reuse it or something, it's an option. Okay, staking tomatoes. One of the things that would be good is to stake your plants early. And I've made this mistake with staking, where I plant the tomato plants and then I don't get around to putting the stakes in, and like these round stakes, like the Texas tomato stakes or these type of stakes. Oh my gosh, if you wait till the plant gets larger, it's real difficult to get all the branches in the right place. So do it early and you'll save yourself a lot of time. There's a wide variety of staking ideas. And our own website, MGS Santa Clara UCNR, okay, that has a whole section on staking on our website, Santa Clara Master Gardener website. And there's lots of great ideas on there that you can stake. So if you have a big indeterminate plant that gets 6 or 8 feet tall, you want to use sturdy stakes. This staking on the upper right-hand corner, that's not going to hold some of the tomatoes. But if you had a determinate plant, this stake on the upper right-hand corner would probably be okay if it's a small plant. So again, read your plant tag or seed package or whatever, and try to find out how big your plant might get. And then you can decide what type of stakes you use. And there's a lot of things you can use other than wire, these wire Texas tomato stakes and stuff like that. So again, go to our website and there's some really cool ideas on there. Okay, pruning tomatoes. This is especially helpful when growing these big indeterminate varieties because sometimes you have so much foliage there. Therefore, some pruning is almost necessary. It also helps some light penetrate into the plant and air circulation, because like I said before, if you don't have enough light and air circulation, your plant won't be as healthy and you're going to get more insect pests, such as maybe aphids, things like that. And slugs and snails sometimes too will crawl in a real moist, lots of foliage. They like that. So you're just kind of encouraging that. So some pruning is fine. And this picture shows where to prune. Sometimes between the main stem and the leaves, you can take some of those off there and it will not hurt the plant. And the other thing, if you have a long tomato vine that's going over your pathway or something, you can cut it off. Don't worry, tomatoes can take it, can tolerate it, very easy. So don't be afraid to do some pruning on your tomatoes or cutting a long branch that's interfering with your walking path. Okay. Okay, watering. Try to maybe water near the root system, not the foliage, because tomatoes can get some foliar diseases if they stay wet all the time. So if you can point the nozzle, if you're overhead watering, point it closer to the root system. If you get some water on the foliage, it's not the end of the world, but if you can get more to right to the root system, that would be good. Okay, you can cut back on watering toward the end of the season. As the plant begins to fruit, you can, if you're in the soil, in garden soil, in your backyard or whatever, you can start reducing water, maybe even in August a little bit and a lot more in September. And usually by the end of September or mid-September, you can almost cut off your water, but not containerized plants. If you're growing tomatoes in containers, in pots, no, don't cut off the water. So the plant could wilt and die in a few days. So you don't want to do that. Okay, a few other things on fertilizer, and there were a few things I forgot to say before. Okay, so every fertilizer package has 3 numbers on it. These are the 3 essential elements. Nitrogen is the first element, and like on these 2 packages, the blood meal, it's a 1200. So the 12 means 12% nitrogen. Okay, so that, so there are state laws and laws that require what you have to put on the fertilizer bag. So you have to put the amount of NPK, nitrogen is the first number, phosphorus and potassium is the third number. You have to put that on the package. And nitrogen is the first number. Now, tomatoes use more nitrogen than anything else. So if you're going to buy a new bag of fertilizer or a new package, it would be nice if nitrogen could be your highest number, because if you get a lot of phosphorus and potassium and you're in the soil, your garden soil or your ground, our clay in California contains a lot of the other elements. It does contain, a lot of our trace elements and also the phosphorus and potassium. So you usually don't have to add much of that, if any at all. If you're adding compost, you may not have to add any. So we feel you're kind of wasting your money and wasting resources if you use a lot of phosphorus and potassium in your garden soil. But nitrogen is the important one. Okay, here on the right-hand side, here's a fertilizer bag. It's a 20-5-10. Okay, so that's okay. At least nitrogen is higher than the other two numbers. So that's good. Now, sometimes you say, oh, 20%, isn't that high? But the rates are on the package are worked out for you. You don't have to figure out anything. If you use a 5, 3, 2 or something, a 5%, you're going to use more, but the rates are figured out for you. If you use a 20% nitrogen fertilizer, you're going to use less, but the rates of application on the package will work. It'll work out because that's what they do. They have to put the correct rate for that analysis. So don't worry about that. Just follow the directions and you should be fine. Now, one of the things we say is, if you're in garden soil, don't use a lot of nitrogen really frequently, like a little bit when you're planting, and then we'll talk about another time of the year when the tomatoes use a lot of fertilizer or nutrients. But you don't want to over fertilize, like don't fertilize all the time and use high rates and all that, because you can attract pests like aphids to your foliage if your foliage contains real high levels of nitrogen. So go maybe toward the lower rates that are on the package. Every package has a rate, like it might say 1 to 5 pounds per 100 or per 1,000 square feet or something like that. Go toward the lower end of the spectrum. Don't go the 5 pounds or over that. Go toward the lower end if you're in, clay soil. Now, if you're in a container though, growing a potted tomatoes in a container, then you need a complete fertilizer. You need the phosphorus and potassium, and you also need the trace elements, because in potting soil, there's not very much of anything in there. So yes, then it's a different story. And then look at the application rates and on the package, and that'll kind of tell you when it runs out of steam. If it says, if it's a water soluble fertilizer and it says apply in 2 weeks, that means it's run out in 2 weeks. If it says reapply in 2 weeks. But usually, you got some leeway there. You don't have to fertilize every single 2-week period. Okay, so here's some more examples: nitrogen, phosphate, potassium. Here's another fertilizer. Oh, and they have to put a guaranteed analysis. So if you're wondering, does it have trace elements in? Because I'm in a container, and does it have phosphate and potash or phosphorus and potassium in it? So then look at the guaranteed analysis. This one has iron and manganese, zinc, magnesium. So this has, most of your main trace elements in it. Okay. Okay, let's see what.
Joan, this is
Yes.
Sharon. While
Okay.
while you're on fertilizer, TT, somebody whose initials are TT, asked, when you said low rate earlier for like manure and fertilizers, what did you mean by low rate?
Good question. I'm glad you asked, because, okay, so on the package, they're going to show, you look at the directions, right? And the directions might say use 1 to 5 pounds of this product per 1,000 square feet. So that's the rate. That's how much you use, right? So the 1 pound, it says 1 to 5 pounds. That's a range, right? You could use 1 pound per 1,000 square feet or 5 pounds. So the lower rate would be the 1 pound. The higher rate would be 5 pounds per 1,000 square feet. Every fertilizer package usually has a range on it. For water solubles, they might say a half teaspoon to 1 teaspoon, or a half teaspoon to 1 tablespoon per gallon of water. And then you mix it and water it in. Okay, the half teaspoon per gallon of water would be the low rate. If you use a tablespoon per gallon, that's the higher end, the high rate. Okay, did I explain that?
That works. And what
Okay.
if you're getting manure from your neighbor who has chickens, or you're using alfalfa pellets or something that doesn't really have a bag with directions?
Yeah, that's more of an amendment. Oh boy, there you'd probably have to go on the web, and I don't have directions for that right now. And you'd probably have to do some research on that yourself. But be careful again about manure that's not composted. So
Great.
you
Thanks,
could,
Joan.
if you're sure it's really well composted by your neighbor, you might want to look online and what the manure packages say. But if it gets something equivalent, like if it's a chicken manure, or you really have to kind of be careful with chicken manure. I know a lot of people who've burnt plants with chicken manure. Manures can have a lot of salts in them. So you don't want to use high rates or anything anything too high, or you could burn the plants. So you might want to look, if you're getting composted manure from a neighbor, if it's steer manure or horse manure, look online and see if there are any packaged products that have that, and look at what their rates are and kind of make a judgment from there.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, so fertilize when blooms and fruit appear. The tomato plant uses most of the nutrients when it is flowering and beginning to produce fruit, like this stage. You see this little fruit on the tomato plant, and it's blossoming like crazy right now. This is a good time to fertilize. Okay, and make sure you water enough after fertilizing. Again, look at the package directions, and you don't have to use the high rates either. With our soil, you should be able to use the lower end of the spectrum when they have the range of rate. Like, okay, now if you're using a water soluble fertilizer, you don't have to really water it in because it's already diluted. They already tell you like a half teaspoon per gallon, and then you water it in. But if you're using a granular or slow release fertilizer, make sure you water enough after fertilizing, because nutrients have to be in a liquid state to be absorbed by the plant roots. So if you just sprinkle some stuff on top and it never leaches down to the plant roots, you're not fertilizing. So now if you're in a container, make sure, again, you use a complete fertilizer, one with the micronutrients or minor elements in it, and the phosphorus and potassium. You need all of it if you're fertilizing and you have your tomato plants in containers or pots. Okay, what varieties to plant? There's all kinds of things you can look at. You want early, late, and a lot of plant tags will show days to harvest, or seed packages especially. Disease resistance, that's a good thing. There's some pretty bad diseases around here. So shape and size, it's what you like. But cherry tomatoes are pretty darn easy to grow. If you haven't grown tomatoes before, you might want to consider that. There's paste, beefsteak, and all kinds of others. Colors, flavors, compact versus big plants. There's determinate versus indeterminate plants. Okay, indeterminate. First, there's really not a big difference in yield. Now, I will say, if you get an indeterminate tomato plant and your season lasts really, really long, say we have really warm weather into the end of October and not very cold nights, you might get a little more yield or a few more tomatoes on the indeterminate tomato plants, but it's more of a variety difference. What variety you choose has a bigger difference than whether you choose a determinate or indeterminate plant. Okay, but anyway, an indeterminate tomato will continue growing until either frost kills them or cold weather makes them go downhill really a lot. And then sometimes they get diseases at the end and just kind of die off. They need really tall, sturdy cages, the indeterminate. But again, look at your plant tag, because there are some indeterminate plants like I think Better Boy, and it doesn't get that large and it still produces, a lot of tomatoes and everything. Okay, so if you're indeterminate, you might want to get the sturdy cages. These are Texas tomato cages. And again, you could use other things than that too to stake them, but you need staking. Okay, now determinate varieties, they stay a lot shorter. They might only get 2 to 4, maybe 5 feet high or so. So sometimes standard tomato cages might work. If you get a really a determinate variety that's really, really short, you might even use those real flimsy, cheap tomato cages that they sell. So again, look at the tomato description and on the plant tag or the seed package and the size, or maybe do some research on Google or something and see if you can find your variety and find that information out. Many of the container varieties are determinate plants. So determinate plants, determinate tomatoes will produce most of their tomatoes within a few weeks, but they'll continue to produce some after that, but not lots of them, where maybe indeterminate are maybe a little more consistent in their production. All right, and now hybrids versus heirlooms. I know a lot of people who haven't grown tomatoes before. You ask them, what are you going to grow? What do you think? Oh, I want to grow all heirlooms. The word heirloom, it does sound really nice and they taste good, but you might want to look at it really carefully. But first, I'll tell you a hybrid, it's not a GMO, by the way, I always get asked that, but a hybrid is just a result of a cross of two different tomato plants. And the plant breeder is trying to get the best characteristic of each of the parent plants. So hybrids are produced under really strict conditions in screened cages, in greenhouses, so they don't have outside influences like wind or insects that will affect the outcome. So the seed is very consistent on hybrids. Okay, let's see, what else? Oh, heirlooms, they're open pollinated by wind or insects, and the seeds you collect or somebody else collects usually contain most of the characteristics of the plant that it came from. But sometimes there are some variation. You might, especially if you had some different tomato plants in the immediate area, sometimes you do get more variability with heirlooms. I noticed even when I buy seeds, there are some heirloom seeds I've bought that one year, maybe the heirloom tomatoes are real big. The next year they're like, they almost look different and they're really small, the same variety. So you do get sometimes some variation with heirlooms. Okay, most heirlooms have longer days to harvest. Most of them mature later in summer, although there are a few earlier varieties too. Let's see here. Okay, disease resistance. This is a big one because, okay, most of your hybrids are a lot more disease resistant than heirlooms. Heirlooms, a lot of the heirloom tomatoes are not very disease resistant. Okay, days to harvest, like I said, a lot of the heirlooms take longer, but not all of them. There are a few early varieties. Yield, in most cases, the hybrids will give a bigger yield than the heirloom tomatoes. Shelf life, the hybrids usually have a better shelf life. Like if you leave them on your kitchen counter for a week or two, usually they have pretty good shelf life. Flavor, this is where, you know, it depends who you talk to and what variety you talk about, that some heirlooms might have a better flavor. So these are all the things you have to judge. But although some of the newer hybrids, and there are still some like Better Boy that have pretty hybrids that have pretty darn good flavor. The other comment I want to make is that, you know, if you pick your tomatoes when they're ripe, even if they're hybrids, as long as they're ripe and you don't put them in the refrigerator right away, you still should have pretty darn good tomatoes. Because one of the things about grocery store tomatoes, they put them in the cooler and it wrecks the flavor. So, all right. Okay, some of the types of tomatoes, geez, there's classics and beefsteaks, but a lot of these categories are getting mixed up because there's lots of new varieties that are hybrids between the two. So you have paste tomatoes and grape tomatoes, and a lot of tomatoes are in between in size-wise, and I don't know what you call them. And sometimes slicers are called classics, or large classics are called beefsteaks. And it also depends on the seed company. I've seen the same variety in different seed catalogs. Some they put classic, some they put beefsteak. So don't get too, these terms aren't that meaningful, I guess. Okay, here are some that are usually considered classic, like Better Boy. And by the way, that's still a pretty darn good tomato, pretty good flavor. I went to a seminar with this professor who specializes in home garden varieties at one of the universities. And he said, you know, you go to the garden center, if you buy Better Boy, you'll do fine. It's productive, you know, good flavor. You can find it almost everywhere. Okay, Whopper, sometimes they consider that. That's getting pretty popular too. That also has pretty good flavor, but that can also be considered a beefsteak because it gets larger. And then Celebrity's been around for a while. I think that was the patent went to somebody right in this area here, in the Gilroy area. And then Early Girl. And there's another one called Big Beef. It's not a classic, it's a beefsteak, but that's a real consistent variety too. That's also a hybrid. Okay, here, this Stupici, I think that's an heirloom, and Green Zebra is an heirloom. These are some more that they classify as classics. Here again, Celebrity, Mountain Magic. Okay, Big Beef, I should say, if you see that at the garden center, that's a pretty good, reliable tomato. And the fruit is big, the yield is really good, flavor is really good. So that would be one to consider, you know, if you're at the garden center. Here's some more beefsteaks and pastes, a lot of different paste tomatoes. Okay, so paste tomatoes, the difference here is that they don't have as much water, they're not as watery. They are thicker, they make a thicker sauce. That's why they make these into tomato paste or salsa, or you can use them, you know, for tomato sauce, and they won't be as runny or as watery. And cherry tomatoes. These are probably the easiest to grow. Even under conditions that aren't fantastic, you usually will get some yield when you grow cherry tomatoes. And there's lots of different varieties. There's some really, this is a really compact variety, this Torenzo. Then there's just lots of varieties to pick from. Okay, again, they're very easy. So if you're a beginning gardener and you haven't grown tomatoes before, you really should consider having a cherry tomato in your garden. You shouldn't be disappointed. Okay. And there's lots of, grape tomatoes too. They're kind of the same size as cherry tomatoes, although this one here is kind of in between a paste and a cherry. They're good. This Juliet, what a producer. That produces huge yields, and they're really good, and they make good, I cut them in half and put them in the dehydrator. Real good, sweet, dehydrated tomatoes. Okay, and here's some more patio and container varieties. These two are in my yard. I grow some cherry tomatoes in pots, and they do just fine. Bush Early Girl, it's kind of a bush type Early Girl. That does real well in containers. So there's a lot more container varieties now because the size of the lots are getting a lot smaller. Okay, here are some more, just for your information here. Some are getting really small too. And this Red Robin, this is a super compact. It's only like an 8-inch plant. I've grown this, but the flavor isn't the greatest, but it's real early. And maybe that's why some of the earliest tomatoes, maybe it's not warm enough yet for the flavor to develop. Okay. There's also the indigo varieties. They're really high in anthocyanin, antioxidants. The breeder is in, I think, Oregon State somewhere, Oregon State University. But you've got to pick these when the fruit softens and when it's ripe. If you pick these when they're purple and hard, oh, geez, they are so bitter. You'll spit them out immediately. So wait till they show a little color and until they're soft. And they are really sweet. They are sweet. And some of they have a new one, Indigo Kumquat, that I'm trying this year. That's supposed to really be good. All right. And then there's grafted tomatoes. I was saying that a lot of the heirlooms are not very disease resistant. Well, for root diseases, there's a solution. And they do a lot of grafting of heirlooms onto a tomato plant that has really good resistance against like fusarium and verticillium wilt disease that attack the roots. Okay, so anyway, they cut off, they grow a plant, like for the rootstock, they cut it off, and then they graft the heirloom variety on top. And I did that one year, and about half of them made it, but you need hands like a surgeon. It's not that easy. It's kind of difficult in a way. So yeah, you have to be very patient and have good hands. Okay, growing in a container. I want to make a couple last points about growing in a container. Your plant selection would be important. A somewhat compact plant would usually work best. Cherry tomatoes grow good in containers too. So I want to make that point, that you don't want to get an indeterminate plant that grows 8 feet tall. You need a gigantic container for that, and it would be hard to manage. Okay, and also when you're growing in a container, the soil, watering, and fertilizer are very important. You want to use a potting soil that drains well. Don't use your clay soil and put that in your container because you won't probably have enough porosity and drainage. You want to keep the soil moist, but never soggy like a sponge. You shouldn't be able it shouldn't be mushy or soggy. But you have to watch the moisture because containers can dry out really fast. And if you go away for the weekend and your tomato plant is in a container and it's in July and it's hot out, you may come back on a Sunday night and your tomato might be dead because once it gets beyond the permanent wilting point, that's it. So you've got to watch the moisture. And the other point that I made before, when you fertilize, you want to use a complete fertilizer, one with nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and the minor elements, and follow the directions for reapplication. And directions have the rate also that you should use, how much to use. The rate is how much to use. All right. Okay, so growing in a container. Yeah, plant selection. I think I did that already. All right, a few things on diseases, pests, and disorders. Okay, let me see what we got here. Okay, one of the most common diseases I would say in our area would be verticillium wilt. That's the middle picture there, where the tomatoes are kind of wilting, turning yellowish and wilting. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, but first we'll talk about, disease resistant. Okay, if you buy a tomato plant, hopefully either on the seed package or in the seed catalog or on the plant tag, they will show what diseases that tomato plant is resistant to. Now, if it says resistant, it doesn't mean it won't ever get the disease, but if it gets it, it may not be as serious. They're usually stronger plants if they have some resistance. Okay, so there's V for verticillium, and I'm not going to go through all this. Tobacco mosaic virus, but I'll show you a few of these diseases and viruses here. Okay, Fusarium wilt and verticillium wilt are two real common root diseases of tomatoes. The first signs of Fusarium wilt are yellowing of shoots and leaves. Sometimes it just occurs on a branch or half the plant. You can see on the right-hand side what it looks like. What it does, this disease, it plugs up the vascular system in the plant, the water conducting tissue, the xylem in the stem. So then there won't be water and nutrients going up into the plant, and it gets yellow and it wilts for lack of water. And you might think, oh, I need more water, but that's not the problem. It's a root disease. Same thing with verticillium. This one is probably the most common in California, more than Fusarium wilt. It's very widespread in California soils. And again, the first sign is often yellowing, sometimes between the main veins and older leaves. They'll turn brown, wilt, and die. And this can persist indefinitely in the soil. But there are resistant varieties available. This is this verticillium wilt. Okay, this is also a vascular, this also affects the vascular system. The water conducting tissue is affected. So you won't get water and nutrients up in the plant. So sometimes the plant starts out as kind of stunted and the fruit would be fairly small, even if sometimes a plant can survive verticillium wilt, but the plant just doesn't look healthy and the fruit is small. This disease is favored by cool spring weather, but symptoms might not show up until when the fruit develops. So this is another reason why not to plant in your soil too early, because you can easily get verticillium wilt. By the way, this fungus, root fungus disease, also affects a lot of other crops like cucumbers and melons and things like that. So don't plant too early because in cold soils, it's even worse. Okay, so here's a picture of verticillium wilt. It's kind of hard to diagnose this. So here's verticillium and here's fusarium. Okay, University of California often tells growers, you might want to send in a sample to a lab because sometimes it's very difficult to distinguish between these two by just looking at the plant. All right. Another bad disease are the viruses. Tobacco mosaic virus, really bad, really bad. The source could be contaminated seed. It's often introduced by tobacco users, can be carried on hands, clothes, anyone who uses tobacco. And sap-seeding insects can spread it too. Aphids, leafhoppers, cucumber beetles can spread it. So contaminated plant material, the virus can stay on other things in your yard for almost forever. And some of the symptoms are mottled yellow, distorted, or puckery leaves. If you see a plant with real puckery leaves, especially the new growth, if it looks really strange and stringy or puckery, you may just want to pull it out. And especially if it's also stunted, pull it out and put it in your green waste container, which will be composted at real high temperatures. I wouldn't even put it in my compost pile, because tobacco mosaic virus will last almost forever. Here's another one. Again, you can see the growth is very distorted. Another virus, tomato yellow leaf curl. Oh, by the way, tobacco mosaic virus, there are lots of resistant varieties. The tomato breeders know this is a big problem. So there are a lot of resistant varieties there. This one is kind of new to California, or it's one of the newer ones. There are some resistant varieties available. This one we've had in Santa Clara County, especially in the South County. I know this has been a big problem, tomato spotted wilt virus. Okay, the stunting is the first symptom. The plant just looks kind of stunted. It might have purplish leaves. If you see this, you may want to destroy the plant, but when it gets fruit, the fruit may not get very large, but when it does ripen, it'll look like these pictures here, real blotchy and spotted all over the place. And they're edible, but they taste awful. You know, you're not going to want to eat them. They're awful. So if you see this, the best thing is to pull out the plant and put it in the green waste. The other thing to do is to control weeds, because weeds can be hosts for the virus. Like in bindweed, we have a bad weed called bindweed. The bindweed can live and can be perfectly healthy. And the tomato spotted wilt virus can be in it. And what happens, the thrips, they feed on the bindweed, then they go feed on tomato foliage and spread it. So the bindweed is like asymptomatic. It's very healthy, but it can live with this virus. And there's, I think, a few hundred plants that can live with this virus, this tomato spotted wilt virus. There are some resistant varieties. Unfortunately, there aren't too many that are sold at the garden centers right now. I always buy some seeds every year that that are resistant to this, because I've had this in my garden, and I want to have some insurance there. So I always buy some seeds, some resistant varieties, and there are more that are coming on the market, especially in the seed company catalogs. Okay, so the tomato spotted wilt virus, it's spread by thrips. Thrips are really, really small. So I was saying before, weeds can be the host for this virus. So control your weeds. Okay, russet mites. Okay, if we have a hot spell in summer, and it's really hot and dry, you probably will get some russet mites. It affects almost everybody. They're a type of mite, and they tend to feed on the bottom foliage first. You might notice browning of lower leaves that are starting to get real kind of bronzy. And if you look really, really, really close and take a magnifying glass, you might be able to see them, but they're very, very, very small, these russet mites. So if we have a hot spell, these russet mites the population can explode during a hot spell. But don't worry so much. If you think you're going to lose the plant, yes, you can spray with wettable sulfur. But the problem with wettable sulfur, well, you have to use it under 90 Fahrenheit for one thing. But the other thing is it can kill your beneficial insects. A lot of times what happens, the russet mite population starts exploding, but then your beneficial insects will come in and take care of the problem, especially if we have a cool down, then if it gets a little cooler. So a lot of times, some of the problems will take care of themselves. So unless it's really, really bad, you may not want to spray. Because remember, even those safe organic products can kill beneficial insects. All right, tomato hornworm. There's the tobacco hornworm and the tomato hornworm. And sometimes they're both on one plant. But I want to just comment the lower picture. If you ever see a caterpillar like this, if it's still alive, don't kill it, because this thing isn't going to survive very long, for one thing, because what happened is there was a braconid wasp that laid eggs inside this caterpillar, and they hatched, and the larvae came out. And this caterpillar, there's no way it's going to survive. But what's going to happen is these larvae are going to turn into more braconid wasps and control a lot of your pests. So that's a good thing. So leave it alone. If you see that, just leave it alone. Okay, tomato pinworm. This isn't a real serious thing. If you see a little bit of this, usually tomato pinworm is controlled by beneficial insects that are in your garden. You may see it looks like a pinprick on top near the stem end of the tomato. Just cut that part off and eat the tomato. Yeah, it shouldn't be a big problem. Stink bugs can be kind of a nuisance. Some years they're worse than others. If you squish them, they smell really, really bad. What they do, they kind of suck the juice out of the tomato skin, and you get these white, dry spots on your tomato, and they don't taste that good. You can cut that off and eat the inside of the tomato, but then sometimes there's not much left. Usually, some beneficial insects will control this. It's usually not a problem that's going to affect everything. I really don't know what to say for stink bugs, because there aren't really any good pesticides that are safe to use on this. So just try to pick them off if you see them, and hopefully you won't get too much damage. You're never going to have a garden with no damage. So you're going to expect a little bit of damage in your garden, okay? Sometimes we've had questions in the helpline, and there's 2 holes in a leaf, and they say, what is this? What should I do? You're always going to have a little bit of damage, because if you let the balance of nature work, there should be beneficial insects or critters that come in and eat some of these pests. Okay, aphids on tomato leaves. Aphids can transmit viruses too, and aphids are our most common garden pest. However, lots of beneficial insects love to eat aphids, and others just lay eggs inside of aphids, and they hatch and eat the inside of the aphid out. So there is a lot of natural control for aphids. One of the things you can do is space your plants properly. Also, maybe do some pruning if the foliage is too thick. Try not to water the whole plant, all the foliage, if it gets wet. Aphids like moist, shady, thick conditions. So try to do whatever you can culturally to make your plant healthy. And you might still get a few aphids, but usually they won't be a big problem. If it's really bad, you can spray a heavy stream of water on your plant. Aphids are not strong insects. Once they get knocked down, usually ground beetles or something else will eat them up. So they're not strong insects. They can't crawl fast. There is insecticidal soap you could spray, but the problem, that also will kill your beneficial insects. Okay, I just wanted to throw this in because I have said a few things about beneficial insects. These are just some plants, if you have in your yard, they are really good for beneficial insects, because if beneficial insects don't have pests to eat, they need pollen because it has protein. And these are some of the flowers that are nice to have in your yard, even cilantro and dill when it's flowering, that attract beneficial insects and have pollen that beneficial insects like. Okay, fruit rot. Okay, try not to let many tomatoes touch the moist soil. That's why staking is good, and keeping tomatoes off the ground. Maybe some mulch is a good idea, dry mulch. Try not to get everything wet when watering, because you can get fruit rot and also slugs. If you get this, you might have slugs too, or snails. Okay, here's a physiological problem, blossom end rot. Okay, they're still studying this quite a bit. It can be like a calcium uptake disorder. Sometimes you might see more of this during cloudy, humid weather, and it also can occur if soil moisture fluctuates a bit. Sometimes you have enough calcium in the soil, but the plant isn't taking it up. And I don't know, the verdict is still out on calcium sprays for the home gardener. Not sure that really is going to help much. It might be after the fact anyway. So the best you can do is try to maintain an even watering schedule. Some varieties are more susceptible than others. Some of the paste tomatoes are more susceptible. Also, scientists now think genetics plays a part in blossom end rot. And there's a lot of research being done right now. So we may have some varieties in the future that don't get blossom end rot. Even now, you will notice that some varieties like never get it. Like I noticed Plum Regal, which is a paste tomato. I grow Plum Regal every year. I've never had it on that, but I've had it on so many different paste tomatoes that I've grown, but not on the variety Plum Regal. Okay, sun scald. Okay, this is another problem. So you want to prune some of your foliage. It can be a problem on peppers too. You want to prune some of your thick foliage out, but you don't want to prune so severely that when it's sunny and hot that your tomatoes aren't covered with some foliage. So try to leave some foliage that's covering most of your tomatoes. And you're going to have maybe a few clumps that are out there in the sun. But this occurs especially when we get those hot spells in summer. If they say we're going to have 4 days of 100-degree weather, the other thing you can do, if you have on your tomato stakes, you might be able to get some clothespins and some white cloth and just put some shade where those tomatoes are exposed. I've done this at times, and it does help, where you just take some clothespins and some white cloth and stake it to your tomato stake on the southwest side of your tomato plant, and that will help. Okay, cat facing. This can be a problem if you have real cool or hot weather during flowering sometimes, but some varieties are more susceptible. And again, the heirlooms are more susceptible to this than most of the hybrids. So you might see some of that. You can just cut it off. There's nothing you can do once it happens. Okay. Picking and storing varieties. Pick tomatoes when they begin to soften. Do not store in the refrigerator. Cold temperatures destroy flavor. Okay, and pick them when they're ripe. The picture on the right-hand side, okay, I'm going to talk more about that picture, but when you see tomatoes in the store, they're usually picked green with hardly any pink color on the blossom end side at all. They're picked green. Then what do? They ship them to a cooler or a big warehouse that's really cold, like 40-some degrees, and they ripen them in there. So they're starting with no flavor, and they're ripening them that they're not going to get much flavor. So then they put them when they're red, they put them in the stores, and you buy them, and they taste like cardboard. Even the ones that say vine ripened tomatoes, they still don't really taste that great because the grocery stores, they all go through the cooler. So try not to put your tomatoes in the refrigerator. But at the end of the season, if you have a bunch of green tomatoes like this here, you can pick them and do what the commercial growers do, but don't put them in the refrigerator or cooler, but just store them in a box or something. And they probably will ripen. If there's any on the blossom end side of the tomato, if there's any pink showing at all, they will definitely ripen and turn red. So they won't taste that great, but you can use them for sauce or whatever you want. Okay. End of life. Okay, sometime probably in mid or late October, tomatoes will look like this. You're going to get black spot and fungal diseases on the fruit. The vines might not look so good because, again, we're probably getting 42 or 45-degree nights, and it's moist. Tomatoes don't do well in this air, this kind of weather. So there's nothing you can do here. It's weather related. So it's telling you it's time to plant your cool season vegetables like broccoli or spinach or something, but it's time to get rid of them and plan for next year, and maybe keep some notes what worked and what didn't this year, so you have even a better crop next year. Okay, and with that, I think you can enjoy your tomato harvest, not just in summer, but all winter, because there's a lot of things you can do with tomatoes. You can dry them, dehydrate them. You can make tomato sauce. You can make if you don't want to can the tomatoes, you can freeze the tomato sauce and it'll last for a long time. So you can enjoy tomatoes all winter as well as summer. Okay, and I think that's it.
Excellent, Joan. Thank you so much. So we've got a few questions.
Okay.
And if anybody has any more as we're talking, go ahead and put them in the chat. So Darusha asked, what about adding sand to the garden bed? Is that good, not good? Any guidelines?
Well,
So this person asked that back when you were talking about what kind of soil mix to use.
well, I mean, you can add sand, but it's not going to do much. Sometimes adding sand, it usually just disappears between particles. And sometimes you can actually decrease the porosity because the sand will get in between the pore space of other particles. So sand, I wouldn't say it's a big advantage to add sand.
Yeah, usually if people are worried about porosity of the soil, it's not sand that's going to do it, it's compost, isn't it?
Yes, compost, and then some of your materials that last a long time, like lava rocks, pumice. I don't like using perlite outside because it floats. For greenhouse stuff or potted plants indoors, it's a great product. But perlite will try to work itself up in the raised bed and float. But lava rock, pumice, things like that have porosity inside of them. They have those clay beads now too. That might help. But then coarse materials like bark, sometimes compost will help, things like that. Yeah. If it's not real fine compost, yeah, it would
And
does
then
very well.
You talked some about containers. What kind of container size do you recommend?
Well, it depends on the type of plant it depends how compact your plant is. But generally, I would say something that's categorized as a 7-gallon or larger container is what I like to use. Now, if you have a super compact plant, again, look at the plant label or try to do some research. Google your variety, whatever it says on the plant tag, and try to do some research how big that plant gets. Because there are smaller, if it's only going to get 2 feet, you could go in probably maybe a 3-gallon or 4-gallon container, maybe. Still,
Yeah.
5-gallon. I like doing a little larger than too small, because if you get in a really small container, the root system is just going to grow so thick and it dries out. Like you can't even water. I mean, it's like you have to water it several times a day then. So,
good point. Can tomatoes be grown indoors under a grow lamp?
well, you've got to have the right lighting. I remember I tried this when I was I'm originally from Wisconsin, and in winter in my basement when I was in high school, I tried growing tomatoes and they just got so leggy, but we didn't have the right lighting. Some of the grow lights are getting better. I think it's going to be difficult. I would look at the most compact variety possible and get the grow lights close to the plant. It's possible, but gee, they still do better outside in summer.
Yeah. Okay, what about squirrels?
Oh, squirrels. Oh, gee. Okay, you're probably going to have to cage it like with some screening or some type of material to keep the squirrels out. I know, I always hear about squirrels.
So if I could give it just a tip on that one, sometimes you'll find rats eat, so roof rats will get into your tomato vines and they'll leave the tomatoes where they are on the vine, or they'll fall down under the vine. Where I know it's squirrels is, number one, you see them because they're so bold, but they'll go sit on top, they'll take the tomato and go sit on top of the fence and eat part of it and then leave the rest of the tomato there. So like Joan said, people are working with cages and other ways to discourage them. At the Palo Alto demonstration garden, we've been trying to circle the bottom of the plant with bird netting kind of piled up, with the theory being that the rats and squirrels don't like to get their feet stuck in it.
That's a good idea.
It makes us feel better. I'm not sure how many tomatoes it saves. Let's see. Somebody asked, any resources to review tomatoes by variety? You know, the catalogs and tags all say how great they are. I posted in the chat the list that we have on our website. Any other suggestions, Joan?
Okay, yeah. You might have this posted already.
Oh, speak into the, I can't hear you.
Oh, okay. In the handout, on the last page of the handout, I have references and links. Okay, there's one that is called Growing Tomatoes in the Home Garden. And it's a UC publication and it lists a whole bunch of varieties and a lot of them that you might find in your garden center. And it's a big chart. It's called Growing, even if you Google this, Growing Tomatoes in the Home Garden. But I do have a link. Do you see that on the handout at all? It's about the fourth thing down on my handout under resource references, links.
Yeah,
It's a
there it is.
publication. And there are times where I wanted to refer to it and I forgot where the link was, and I put Growing Tomatoes in the Home Garden and it came up right away in Google. It's really good. It's a 7-page article by University of California, and it lists a whole bunch of varieties. And most of these varieties are things that varieties that you can find in the garden center, like Big Beef, Early Girl, Better Boy, Brandywine, you know, all those real common tomatoes. So I think this would be real helpful for, you know, anybody who's concerned about looking to see it, because you see lists a V or an F if it's verticillium or fusarium disease resistant. If you see nothing there, that means that probably not disease resistant. But anyway, they list a bunch of stuff in that chart they have.
Great. I just put the link in the chat for people.
Okay.
And if I could put in a plug for a good old-fashioned tomato tasting. So now that we're all getting back, hopefully we'll be able to be out tasting our tomatoes. You can do it outside, but talking to neighbors and friends about what tomatoes they grow and sharing them is the way I've learned about good varieties.
Yes.
Another question, can you treat the soil for any of these wilt diseases?
Well, it's difficult if you live in the Bay Area. If you, I used to work in commercial horticulture, and in Fresno, it really gets hot. And what they would do is put sheets of plastic, and you can just cook the soil and nematodes and a lot of your fungal diseases just die because they just put the clear plastic over the soil. So they're solarizing their soil. But that doesn't work so good here because we don't get hot enough weather. I don't know, I read something that maybe if you're in Morgan Hill or Gilroy inland, that if you did it 6 weeks or 8 weeks over the whole summer, you might have some effect. But Palo Alto, you don't get a lot of real hot sunny weather. Like Fresno, it works, but in the Bay Area, it's kind of spotty, and there's no chemicals that you would want to use either. And that you wouldn't be able to get them anyway. And now they're all being taken off the market, those old fumigation chemicals. So that's about the only thing you could do is solarize the soil or steam it. But I don't know, that would be hard to do if you don't have a gigantic tractor with a steamer on.
Right. And then, oh, do you want to stop sharing your screen? It went blank. And then Eric pointed out that some predatory stink bugs are beneficial.
Yes, yeah, you're right.
Very true.
Right.
Very true. Ronlyn asked about purple tomatoes. So what is a purple tomato? Okay,
well, there's several. Okay, first the indigo series, they all start out purple, but then they kind of turn a tinge of orange or gold or reddish, depending what variety you get. But then there's other purple tomatoes. Some that come to my mind are like purple Cherokee or Cherokee Carbon, which is a hybrid heirloom variety. Cherokee Carbon, it's the Carbon and Cherokee that were bred together. Okay, so yeah, but you know, when you cut them open, they're not pure purple inside. They kind of have a tinge of purple.
Yeah, and then Eric is pointing out that he's heard that if you rotate broccoli where you plant tomatoes, that it kills the verticillium wilt in the soil. I'm not sure it kills it, but it may inhibit it.
Okay, there are a whole bunch of experiments. I think in Salinas, they did experiments, and in some other parts, extension people have done experiments with that. I don't know if the verdict is still out and how effective it is. I wouldn't say if you plant broccoli and you leave it in you compost it right in your soil, I don't think that's a guarantee that it's going to kill verticillium wilt. The verdict is they're still kind of experimenting with this. And I think I read an article, it was out of Salinas, they had a huge broccoli field and they let all the broccoli compost, they just tilled it in and let it compost. And they did find less of some of the soil fungus diseases in there because I don't know if it was the sulfur, something in the broccoli was acted sort of like a fumigant. But again, how effective is it? And I don't know. I think there's still research being done.
Yeah, don't we generally, if people have verticillium or fusarium wilt in their soil, we generally recommend if you have the space that you rotate beds where you're planting.
But it can last pretty long in the soil. It depends how old you are, I guess. But the other thing is to plant in containers.
Right.
You know, that's always a really good solution. Plant in containers.
Yeah. Yeah.
And now there's so many more compact varieties that are good for containers.
Yeah. So you can always plant resistant varieties as well.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we all know these are viruses, right? And we all know how tough viruses are to kill right about now.
Yeah, you really can't do much once your tomato gets a virus. That's it. I mean, there's nothing you can do once it gets it.
We don't have a Dr. Fauci for verticillium wilt, huh?
Yeah. The wilt diseases in the soil, and verticillium is our most common wilt disease. So yes, if you're growing in the soil and you think you have it, use resistant varieties, because I think I have it in my soil and I use a lot of resistant varieties. I always look to see it, the V, and then they have races V1 or V5, and the more V's I see on there, the better. So I do that, and I have pretty good luck. The other thing, don't plant too early, because verticillium wilt usually is worse. It acts up more in cooler soil. So that's another tip.
And Kelly is saying that they've tried bird netting and it didn't work.
Oh.
So I keep staring at this picture you've got up on the screen. If I could put in a plug for drying tomatoes, boy, I discovered dried tomatoes a while ago, and I now plant varieties just so that I can dry them. They're wonderful. I bag them up and store them in the freezer, and have never had any problem with them keeping. We run out well before the next crop comes in.
Yeah, me too. Do you dehydrate yours then?
Yeah.
Yeah, I do too. I know dried tomatoes, they're so full of flavor and sweetness. Like in winter, you put them on a salad and oh my gosh, they're just so good.
Now, if somebody wants to know how we dry them.
I bought a dehydrator.
I have an old, like 40-year-old dehydrator.
Oh, you can do it in the oven too. My neighbor does it in the oven under low heat. Yeah, you can do them in the oven too, but you got to watch it. You have to experiment a little bit what heat works.
Yeah, it's real low heat. I think it's 170, 170, 165, something like that is where I dry mine. So it's real low heat. You can dry them out in the sun, but our sun here isn't always consistent enough. Again, if we were in Fresno, we could dry them in the sun.
Right. Yeah.
Here it's pretty tough.
Yes.
Well, I think we've answered all the questions that I'm seeing in the chat. So I think we're good to go. Everybody's ready and drooling and ready for their new tomato crops. So thank you, Joan, for this great presentation. And thanks again to the Palo Alto Library for co-sponsoring the event. And thank you to all of you for attending and for listening and chatting about tomatoes. For additional information, please check out our website. I know that's how you found us. So it's mgsantaclara.ucanr.edu. If you have any specific questions about something growing in your garden, feel free to contact our Santa Clara County Master Gardener Help Desk or participate in our monthly online plant clinic if you have any plant diseases that come up. And with that, I'll say good night from the two of us. Take care and happy gardening. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.